embarrassing remark from Polly Toynbee, which is worth reading on everything else, but I've really come across the Atlantic to tell you something that you all know perfectly well already. I think it's remarkable, actually, that for hundreds of years, since before the French Revolution, people have had an intuition that inequality was divisive and socially corrosive. And in fact, that's all the data shows you. It shows you that that intuition is true. The interesting thing is that many of you know the data too. And if I ask you which countries in the rich developed world have the most homicides, you probably know that you do. If I ask you which have the lowest homicides, you probably know that it's Japan and the Nordic countries. If I ask you about obesity or prison populations or teenage birth rates, basically, I'm afraid the answer is roughly the same. What people don't understand is how closely those differences line up with the scale of income differences between rich and poor. So I'm going to show you that data and then suggest what's going on that gives rise to those relationships. I should say, Jack mentioned our book is called The Spirit Level, which is, I'm afraid, not something to do with spirituality. In England, we call a carpenter's level a spirit level, what you just call a level. And you can see the relevance of a level to inequality, and also to our endless graphs that have different lines, and different slopes. So that's the title. But I'd like to start with this photograph because, well, they look totally miserable. You know, we always try and smile, but actually that's to hide how miserable we are. This is actually, you'll be glad to know this isn't taken in the United States, it's taken in London, morning rush hour. Every single face is gloomy. And I'm afraid, you know, we are almost as unequal as you. But the point of showing you that is that one of the remarkable things about our societies is the extraordinary contrast between the material success of our societies and their many social failings. You know, if I'd been living in the 19th century and someone had told me about the levels of wealth we'd have by now, you know, the vast majority of the population have much more food than they need. Most people have air conditioning. Even most of the poorest 10–15% of the American population have some kind of air conditioning. The vast number of families have cars, most of them more than one, DVDs, goodness knows what electronic gadgetry. And that's not just true in the United States, it's true in many of the rich developed countries. And yet at the same, I mean, if we'd been told that, if we'd known we were moving towards that kind of future, we'd think it was some kind of social utopia. You know, that there'd be extraordinary harmony, we'd all be living in a wonderful world. But actually, levels of mental illness have been going up for the last generation or so. Really good data, it's not just increased reporting. Well, I'm often appalled at home by the statistics of self-harm amongst teenage girls. But you know your figures on drugs and violence and so on. And I think we've not just puzzled, but quite worried about these social trends. And I don't think anyone feels we have a good understanding of them. You know, people blame sometimes the lack of religion, sometimes they blame teachers, sometimes they blame parents, but without very much evidence of any of these. I'm going to show you that actually, well, I should say first, our book is sometimes called A Theory of Everything because we deal with a huge range of problems. Not only kids dropping out of school, but drug problems, antisocial behavior, teenage births, overcrowded prisons, levels of violence, health, whatever it is. But actually, it's our book is basically a theory of problems which have what we call social gradients, more common at the bottom of the social ladder in the most deprived areas. You know, and whether you're talking about ill health or violence or teenage births or poor educational performance, you know, while all those problems occur at the top of society as well, they get more common as you look further down the social scale. You can look at those social gradients and you can think, well, maybe it's the resilient moving up socially and the vulnerable moving down, and that's why they exist. And you can imagine actually sorting out, well, this audience. We could sort you out by hair colour. We could put the fair-haired ones that side and the dark-haired ones that side, and so on, and we could make a social gradient. Maybe if we did from back to front it would be a gradient, as it's a rape theatre. But no amount of sorting would make any particular hair colour more common. I'm going to show you that these problems are anything from twice as common to 10 times as common in societies with bigger income differences. And basically all I'm showing you is that problems that you know are related to social status within our societies get worse if you increase the social status differences. And I think that means that substantially these problems are responses to social status differentiation itself, to social hierarchy. People often ask me, why don't we classify by other measures of social status? You know, our attempts to compare class differences have similar definitions of class between one society and another. We use income differences because it allows you to see how big the differences are between different social groups or across the whole society. And basically, bigger income differences intensify the effects of social differentiation. I think what I'm talking about is whether the social pyramid in our societies is a steep one like that, a very tall social hierarchy, or whether it's a much shallower one. And understanding the relationships I'm going to show you is a very similar problem to understanding how social status or social class, whatever word you like to use, imprints itself on us from early childhood onwards. But I say that the bigger income differences, the bigger material differences, intensify those processes. So let me move on to actually I want to start with this really just to get absolute levels of income, absolute material standards of living out of the way. Here you've got life expectancy in relation to national income per person. And you see the very rapid rises in life expectancy in the early stages of economic growth, and then it levels out. We still get rises in life expectancy, but no longer in the rich countries on the top right, no longer related to GNP per capita. And if you look at measures of well-being or happiness, you get a very similar shape. Rapid rises early on and then leveling off. And I think what that graph is showing us is that there are diminishing returns to economic growth. You know, life doesn't go on getting better forever. There are diminishing returns to increases in most things. And I think this is telling us that although economic growth is what's transformed the real quality of our lives over the generations, for us in the rich world, having more and more of everything makes less and less difference. It's really important in the developing countries where many people haven't got basic necessities to get richer, but not in the rich world. I'm going to talk just about the countries, those rich countries on the flat part of that curve, the top right-hand part. I'm going to blow that up so you can see those that bit more clearly. Exactly the same data. There it is. Those are the countries I'm talking about. Rich developed market democracies, all of them. You see the countries on the right, Norway, USA, are twice as rich as Israel, Greece and Portugal. And it makes not the slightest bit of difference to life expectancy. There's no suggestion of a relationship there. And yet, within our societies, you all know that health is worst in the most deprived areas. If you look at the richest areas of the United States, the richest census tracts, and compare them with the poorest, you find, even after people have got over, the risks of infant mortality and so on, even at age 16, there are still 16-year differences in life expectancy. And really huge differences. I know every country has these health inequalities, that are bigger in some countries than others. But I think this is the biggest human rights abuse in the modern world. It's considerably worse than locking up people without trial. Not that I'm recommending that. So within our societies, there are these social gradients in health. This is rather old data. It's looking at death rates of zip code areas classified by the median income of the zip code areas. So on the right, you have the lowest death rates in the richest zip code areas and the highest death rates in the poorest zip code areas. Note that these health inequalities are not a difference between the poor and the rest of society. Again and again, when you start talking about health inequalities, people start thinking of unemployment and homeless people. But you've got to understand we're all part of this picture. It runs right across society. Even the people just below the top have less good health than the ones at the top. You need an explanation that is able to explain that. The homelessness and so on presumably contributes to the high death rates in the poorest areas. But most of it is not explained by things like that. Michael Marmot, the foremost researcher, I suppose, in the world on these health inequalities, says you can take away all the problem of poverty and ill health, and you've still got most of the problem of health inequalities left. You can see why he says that. Sorry, I want to make one more point about this. You see, there's this paradox. Income, or something like it, is very important within our societies, and yet it didn't matter between them. What's going on? That is a paradox. Why does income not matter when you look at GNP per capita between countries, and yet it seems to be so important within them? The explanation is that within our societies we're looking at the effects of relative income, or social status, social position, where we are in relation to each other, and the size of the differences between us. That's what matters, not the average income of our whole society, unless you're talking about the developing countries, the much poorer ones. So once you've got that idea that now we are looking at the effects of relative income or social position, you should start thinking, what happens if you stretch out those differences or squash them up? Make the inequalities bigger or smaller. And that's really what I'm going to talk about. We're never talking about some hypothetical utopian society with perfect equality. We're never talking about the most awful tyrannies with really terrible inequality. We're talking about the levels of inequality in different rich developed market democracies. We took this measure of inequality, how much richer the top 20% and the bottom 20% in each country. We used that because it's available, it was available on the World Bank and the UN website, and people understand it. If you talk about Gini coefficients, it's a more complicated measure, and people don't feel they know quite what you're talking about. And on that measure, you see that the more equal countries on the left, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, top 20% in each of those countries is 3.5 or 4 times as rich as the bottom 20%. But in the UK, Portugal, USA, Singapore, the differences are twice as big. On that measure of inequality, we are twice as unequal as the more equal of the market democracies. You might think they're all much of a muchness. And in fact, we could pop you down in any one of them and you'd feel that living standards were rather similar. Many of the shops would be the same, and the kinds of goods people had at home. But huge differences in the amount of inequality. And so, basically, what I'm going to tell you is, show you is what those differences do to each society. What we did was collect internationally comparable data on as many of those problems with social gradients, the important ones with social gradients, as we could find good quality data on. We never decided which country's data was comparable with which. We just went to the OECD website or UN or World Bank or WHO and took their data. So we don't make decisions about comparability, we let them do it. That excludes bias. And here you've got, basically, this puts together our results. We collected international data on life expectancy in each country, kids' maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, levels of trust, that's how much people feel they can trust others, obesity rates, mental illness, and the standard psychiatric diagnosis classification, it includes drug and alcohol addiction, and some figures on social mobility. There they're all put into one index, and they're weighted equally. We use Z scores, so for those of you who've done some statistics, so the country's position is sort of average on all those kind of things. And you see that extraordinarily clear tendency for the more unequal countries on the right to do worse on all those kinds of things. The measure of income inequality is the one I've just shown you. I'm going to use it repeatedly. In our book, we only use that measure of inequality, and we don't show any other people's data. We just, for the same group of countries, with the same measure of inequality, show one problem after another is worse. I'm going to show a few other people's work, because sometimes people think we've invented it all. But look, if you put that same index in relation to gross national income per head, there's no relationship. You might think there's a suggestion of a downward drift, but that's only because Portugal's up on the top left. Remember, USA is on the top right. You can see why there's no correlation. We were bothered that people would think, as inequality is such a politically hot potato, that people would think we'd chosen problems to suit our argument. So we did a paper in the British Medical Journal looking at the Unicef Index of Child Wellbeing. It's an index made up to measure child well-being in the rich countries. It has 40 components. We had nothing to do with their selection and putting it together. In a way, you might regard this as something like an index of adult well-being. So what about children? The UNICEF index contains just about everything they could find. So whether kids can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying at school, how well they do in these international maths and literacy tests, what immunization rates are like, whether kids have books at home, all that goes into it. And here it is in relation to that same measure of inequality. Basically, more unequal countries with lower levels of child well-being. But once more, take that same measure of child well-being, the same figures up the side for each country, and look at it in relation to national income per head. There's absolutely no relationship. Children's charities talk a lot about child poverty as the problem, and they fail to distinguish so often between relative poverty and absolute poverty because it makes it less controversial. You know, if it's absolute poverty, then what we do need is economic growth and more incentives to industry and so on. But actually all the data says that what matters is how far behind us families with children are, how unequal the societies they're growing up in are. We looked actually at all the major components of the UNICEF index. They're grouped, I think, into 6 or 8 different components, and just about all of them are much more closely related to inequality than anything else. What matters is the scale of income differences. It's relative poverty that matters. I won't bother you with that. There isn't a UNICEF index for American states, but there's the the data for different outcomes. Correlations with child outcomes in the American states with income inequality much closer than with average income. With correlations with average state income mostly don't reach significance. Anyway, I should have said before showing you this that we not only looked at someone else's index of well-being, so we wouldn't be accused of selecting data, but we also used two different test beds. We looked at the rich developed countries that I've just been showing you. We also used the American states. We took the 50 states and asked, do the more unequal states do less well on all these kinds of things than the more equal states? And the picture is very similar, whether you're looking at internationally or amongst the American states. There are a few differences that we go into in the book, but almost everything that's related to inequality internationally is also related to inequality in the American states. I'm going to show you now some of the separate components of our index. This is trust from the World Values Survey. It's simply what the proportion of the population who feel that most people can be trusted. Okay. And you see on the right, more unequal countries, it's maybe around 15% feel they can trust others. In the more equal societies, on the left, it rises to 60 or 65%. If you look at Putnam's measures of social capital, in his first study of Italy, Making Democracy Work, the Italian regions, or Bowling Alone, they're all closely related to income inequality. And I think what that is telling us is that that intuition I mentioned earlier, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive, is extraordinary, profoundly true. And you know that we haven't had that intuition for centuries for no reason at all. It is picking up on fundamental human truth. This is that same measure of inequality amongst the American states, just so you can see how similar the picture is, whether you look at things internationally or amongst the American states. This is from the federal government's General Social Survey. Proportion of the population who agree most people can be trusted. This is mental illness. It's not people coming into the doctor or going in having hospital treatment for mental illness, because that would be too influenced by different healthcare systems, whether you had to pay for care and so on. To allow us to make accurate comparisons of mental illness in different countries, WHO used the same diagnostic interviews on random samples of the population in each country. And there you have threefold differences in the proportion of the population who had any mental illness in the preceding year. Now it goes from about 8% at the bottom left up to 26% at the top right. Threefold differences in levels of mental illness. The most closely related component to inequality was, I think, anxiety problems. This is infant mortality. On this one, you might think that the regression line should be a bit steeper to go through the, it's a line of best fit, to go through the main scatter points. It's being pulled down the right-hand side by Singapore. You see it right at the bottom right. Singapore reports to WHO the lowest infant mortality in the world. I never believed that figure. But we have an absolute rule that if our data source gives data for one of the countries we're looking at, it goes into the analysis. So this graph is exactly the same as in our book. But people criticize us saying we pick and choose data. We do have that absolute rule that the data goes in whether we like the data or not. Since the book came out, I've been invited to give some lectures in Singapore, and I was told one of the reasons why the infant mortality is low, it's because this is just one of the reasons, there are some others. About 25% of the population are migrant workers. than the poorest 25%, where you'd expect infant mortality to be highest. You know, it's always highest at the bottom of society. To prevent people getting citizenship, they give people health checks twice a year, every 6 months. Migrant workers get health checks. If they're pregnant or married, they get sent home. You are not allowed to, if you're a migrant worker, to have a baby that gains Singaporean nationality or to marry, so you would gain it by marrying a Singaporean. So basically, you take the section of the population where you expect infant mortality to be highest and just remove it from the picture and report such low levels of infant mortality to WHO. It's interesting, a number of times we found odd things about figures because they're outliers, but they always go in. Oh, I may say, when in a graph like that there are many countries missing, it's not because we didn't like them. It's because WHO hadn't yet produced that data. When we first published this graph in a journal, there were even fewer data points, but we had reasons to think it should be taken seriously, and since then I think figures for New Zealand and Australia have come in very much where we'd expect them to for the level of inequality. So repeatedly we found that this suggestion that inequality is affecting these outcomes seems to have predictive power. That is an early paper, again published in the British Medical Journal by some Canadians, and they're looking at death rates of men at working age in American states and Canadian provinces. They're using a different measure of inequality, but in the more equal societies here on the right, and all the other graphs on the screen on the left. This one's homicide. Again, US states in red and Canadian provinces in blue. And again done by, this is Daly and Wilson, the real experts on violence, McMaster, I think. But what you see there is about tenfold differences in levels of homicide, and as you see, closely related to inequality. In our book, the relationship is less dramatic. We don't show the most dramatic examples from the literature, we just show, as I said, the same group of countries, the same measure of inequality. And our critics pick off a few of the countries and say, it doesn't look significant if you take away these two countries, or something like that. To which I say, so what? There are 50 papers in the academic literature showing that violence is robustly related to inequality. It doesn't matter what our data says. Our book isn't important for showing new data, it's important for making the picture available to people as clearly and simply as possible. This is teenage birth rates. I'm not going to go on with these further. You've got the idea that the outcomes are worse in more unequal countries, but I think you should have a feel for the separate components of our index. And see the scale of differences. I mean, this is births per 1,000 teenage women. It goes from about 5 births per 1,000 women, teenage women, up to, well, in Britain we have the highest in Europe, 31 per 1,000. You've got just over 50 per 1,000. And in a sense, you aren't really an outlier, because given your level of inequality, your teenage birth rate is only a little bit higher than we'd expect. Imprisonment. Proportion of the population in prison. Extraordinarily close relationship. It's a log scale up the side, which means it's a bit harder to see. And log scale compresses the top. Basically, the difference between 1 and 10 is the same as 10 to 100 or 100 to 1,000. If not, if we hadn't done it like that, that would have gone curling up off the top of the screen. But again, you've got sort of tenfold differences. It goes from around 40 prisoners per 100,000 population up to 400. most of that is not a matter of more crime. Only about 25% of it is more crime. We found a couple of American research papers trying to account for the rising prison populations. And it's clear that most of it is more punitive sentencing. And I think you need to, and I don't know whether that is less, more fear up and down the hierarchy, less trust, less empathy, but I think you need to put it into the same sort of bag of considerations as the lower levels of trust that I showed you earlier, the higher levels of, the lower levels of community life and so on. I have just two jokes and I repeat them endlessly, and they're both Kate's jokes. My co-author, she likes to remind people that actually Greece is partly an outlier there because a helicopter landed in the prison yard, 2 prisoners got in and flew away, and it was a big story in our papers, an amusing story, because it was the second time those 2 prisoners had got out by helicopter. So I think the moral is, when you do a bank raid, you should give some of the proceeds to a friend with a helicopter, just in case you need it. But actually, you know, there are all sorts of, in the American states, it tends to be the more unequal ones that retain the death penalty. Here, the USA and Singapore retain the death penalty. No EU country has the death penalty. I think maybe Israel still has it. I don't know whether they use it. Dropping out of high school, it's fairly self-explanatory. This is education scores, those maths and literacy scores. It's not a close relationship, but it is statistically significant, a tendency for more unequal countries to have lower levels of these international maths and literacy scores. I should say that for those of you who are less familiar with statistics, that when you get a wide scatter like this, it means there are a lot of other important influences on the outcome. When you get a very narrow line up all along the line, it means that the inequality we're looking at is probably the most powerful influence. But still, the tendency for one end of the graph to be higher than the other shows the average effect of, in this case, inequality. Social mobility. Barry showed you figures of social mobility. A different date and probably a slightly different method from these. This is income mobility, intergenerational income mobility, and basically what they've done is use the large cohort studies of samples of the population in different countries where kids born in a particular year have been followed through, and they said, they've asked, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons, or is there no connection between the two? And what we see here is that more unequal societies, father's income is more important for what happens to children than in the more unequal countries. And the second joke is that if you Americans want to live the American dream, you should go to Denmark. You've got a much better chance of moving up. So I don't know what Denmark's laws are on citizenship, but I expect if you have a baby there, or if you marry a Dane, you can stay, unlike Singapore. People often talk about this relationship, which is really telling us that, you know, that idea of social mobility as a justification or making big income differences all right. You know, we know that no country comes close to equal opportunities. And what this is telling us is that the more unequal our societies, the more unequal the income differences are, the further away we are from equal opportunities. And indeed, if you're concerned with equal opportunities for children, probably the most important thing to do is to reduce the scale of inequality in the society overall. People often talk about it as if the sort of social ladder becomes steeper, or the rungs on the ladder further apart. But I suspect you have to think of it instead in terms of, not those analogies, but that more unequal societies, there's more downward prejudice, more class prejudice, more prejudice against ethnic minorities and so on. I think also more prejudice against women. We have a bit of data on that. But I suspect that's what's going on. This is another graph where more data has come in since we first published and come in very much where we'd expect it to be given levels of inequality. We've looked at all these various things. I can't go on showing it to you if ever. Suicide is an exception. Suicide is more common in more equal societies, significantly so. Interestingly, depression, which you thought would be what leads to suicide, is more common, like everything else, in more unequal societies. I think what is going on is there's a lot of truth in that, if you like, cliche that violence either goes in against yourself or out against other people. A very famous paper on health in Harlem in New York, which showed that at most ages death rates were higher than in Bangladesh. The only cause of death which was not higher in Harlem than the rest of the United States was suicide. I think it is partly a matter of whether you blame other people or yourself for what goes wrong. But also, I don't know really, you might think of this as me trying to find some wriggle room, but I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction of our main thesis, because in many countries suicide does not have the social gradient all these other things do. In some societies, suicides are more common further up the social scale. Right. Now, I've talked a lot about I pointed out the scale of the differences. You know, sometimes it's a twofold difference, as in infant mortality rate, sometimes threefold differences in mental illness, but sometimes tenfold differences. The differences are so big because it's not just the poor who are being affected by inequality. You can do back of the envelope calculations and think, okay, to drive differences in the average scores of each country as big as that, what would you have to assume was happening to the poorest 10%? And it's completely implausible. But fortunately, we don't have to infer that it's not just the poor who are being affected from that kind of data. We have about 5 different examples in our book where you can look at people given their social status, comparing people at the same social status in more and less equal countries, or more and less equal states. I'm going to show you this, but I think it's a silly one for me to put in because it needs more explaining. This is some of our work. We looked at death rates in each American county. You have 3,100 and something counties, and we looked at death rates by median county income. And we separated the counties very simply by whether they're in the more or less equal states. And you see that county death rates are lower at all